All right, welcome folks. The focus of this presentation is on the ACT reading skill of the big picture. Remember, we learned the other day that big picture questions make up approximately 10% of the questions that you'll answer during the reading section. So this means you'll be answering approximately one big picture question per passage, which makes sense because there's usually only one big picture. Now, the big picture questions require you to use the following skills. We have to be able to determine the central ideas and themes of a passage, and we have to understand the author's or character's perspective and purpose. And these things should sound familiar because they're skills that you practice in your English classes and in other classes such as social studies on a regular basis. So, what's the point? Well, really, that's what big picture questions are asking you to figure out. So we're going to dive in now to the first type of big picture question that you will be asked to answer on the ACT reading section, and that is the main point question. The main point questions ask you to find the primary focus of a paragraph or a passage. These questions are not asking you to find a topic. They're not asking you for small details. And they're also not asking you why or how something functions in the passage. Those are actually other types of questions that we'll focus on later in our course. So what you're looking for is the primary focus. There's a few questions you can ask yourself as you're searching for the main point in a passage or a paragraph. And the first one is, what's the overarching argument here? And the second question you can ask yourself is simply, what does this say? Now, the second type of big picture question that the ACT asks you to consider is a perspective question. Perspective questions are about the central perspective, attitude, or point of view of the author or narrator in a paragraph or in the passage as a whole. So notice we could be thinking about several different things here. It might be a perspective, okay? It might be an attitude. So here we've got to think a little more about tone. It could also be point of view. These questions are kind of difficult because they require you to synthesize a large amount of information that you've seen over the course of a paragraph or passage to be able to figure out what an overall perspective is. So as we're doing this, there's a couple questions that we can ask ourselves that will help us stay on the right track. The first one is, whose perspective am I specifically searching for? Now, particularly in passages such as the literary narrative or the prose passage, you will potentially come across multiple characters who might actually have different perspectives. You will also have one passage that has two different paired passages rather than just one longer one. So we've got to make sure we're looking for the right perspective in a situation like that. And this question can help us do that. The second question that we can ask to make sure we're on the right track is whether the thing we've identified is the overarching perspective, attitude, or point of view that the narrator or author has in the referenced portion of the passage. Maybe they change their mind at some point. Maybe they represent different perspectives. So we've got to make sure that we're really focusing on this central big picture here. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about how we actually build these skills. So let's take a look at some concrete steps you can take to improve your big picture skills. The first of these is to check the introduction and the conclusion of the passage. Authors often begin and end their writing with references to their big ideas, their main ideas. So those are great places to look to give yourself a hint about what the whole passage is about. Now, if you've been asked about the purpose of a paragraph or the main point of a paragraph, rather than the passage as a whole, you can do the same thing on a smaller scale by checking the first and the last sentences in that paragraph itself, which can also lead us to figure out what the overall ideas in that paragraph are. Our third strategy is to use keywords to guide us. Now, we might think about keywords as big picture topics that are referenced often in the passage, but we especially want to pay attention to contrast words or direction words that give us hints about the author's perspective. And finally, the last skill building strategy that we can practice for answering big picture questions is to actually answer the question in your own words. This can help us avoid some of the common pitfalls and recognize wrong answers more easily when we see them, if we've already taken the time to figure out the answer in our own heads. So at this point, go ahead and pause the video and give yourself approximately 4 minutes to read this passage. We are going to be looking at a natural science passage adapted from Consider the Eel by Richard Schweid. And we'll be using the strategies and skills that we've just learned to do a model question. So take a minute to read it on your own and then press play when you're finished. All right, welcome back. What I'm going to do now is kind of walk you through a bit of annotating that I did as I read this passage myself. So what I've done here is kind of identified the overall point of each paragraph as I read, or the main thing that it talks about, and I've also made a few annotations underlining some key words, which are strategies that we just discussed. So in the first paragraph, the big idea was that scientists know or accept that all eels in North America, the Caribbean, and Europe are born in the Sargasso Sea. Now, I did underline a couple of words in the passage, words like the known facts, because I thought it was interesting that they didn't just say the facts, okay, as they are pretty much universally accepted. So these key words here are giving me a hint about what the author thinks, okay, and about what the main idea of this passage is. And this author is emphasizing that knowing these things is maybe not 100% certain. There might be some doubt involved, okay? So I thought it was important to recognize that as I was continuing to read. The second paragraph here gave us some background on how eels hatch and what determines where they end up, which was their species. In the third paragraph, we learned what larvae look like when they're young and what they look like when they reach brackish water. In the fourth paragraph, the author described how eels reach their home in the rivers and how scientists determine their age. So far I'm getting a lot of information kind of about the life cycle of the eel. In the fifth paragraph, the author discusses the reproductive journey from the rivers to the sea and the major biological changes undergone by the female eels. So again, here we're kind of talking about the life cycle, learning what their lives are like, how they go from place to place, and what changes happen to their bodies along the way. Now, in the last paragraph, I started to get some hints of the same uncertainty that I noticed in the first paragraph. The author starts off by saying, at least that is what today's marine biologists and naturalists tell us. So I'm getting hints here of some doubt, right? Because adult eels have never been seen doing all of these things that the scientists just described, okay? So we've got keywords here like scientists are assuming that these things take place. The author does use a word like however here to show that these still seem to be pretty substantiated claims, but he's emphasizing the fact that scientists believe these things. So the big idea in this paragraph was that scientists' knowledge of eel life cycles, while strong theories, are not 100% certain. So now that we've kind of done an overview of the passage itself, let's take a look at our question. And the question states, one of the main ideas established by the passage is that... Okay, and I have actually blacked out the answers for us here because I want us to take a look at our skill building strategies that we discussed. So we're going to check the introduction and conclusion. Because this question asks about the passage as a whole, we will not check sentences in an individual paragraph. We will, however, look for key words. We're going to answer the question in our own words, and then we'll finally use process of elimination to avoid the wrong answer traps. So let's come back to our passage with our annotations. So as I was looking at this passage, we noticed that the middle of the passage is about the eel life cycle itself. But this focus is framed by the first and the last paragraphs. And these paragraphs focus more on the uncertainty, since many of the phenomena have not actually been observed by scientists. All of the key words that we recognized earlier emphasized this big idea. So what I'm going to do now that I have looked at the first and last paragraph and I have looked for key words is put the central idea in my own words, try to answer the question on my own. And I think the central idea of the passage is that scientists still have uncertainty about their knowledge of eels. So now that we've done that, let's take a look at the question itself and see what answer choices we have. All right. One of the main ideas established by the passage is that, let's look at option A and start using process of elimination. It says, researchers have nearly exhausted their resources after spending decades investigating the Sargasso Sea. I do not recall reading anything about exhausting resources. Okay, I know they spent decades investigating the sea, but this wasn't part of the passage. So I can go ahead and eliminate this because its wrong answer type is, well, it's simply not there. Okay, so let's look at option B. One of the main ideas established by the passage is that significant gaps still remain in researchers' understanding of the life cycle of eels. That sounds almost identical to the main idea that I came up with on my own. So I'm going to go ahead and circle this one because I think it sounds right. But just to be sure, we'll go through the last two answer choices to see if we can eliminate them also. Option C says eels live their entire lives in the Sargasso Sea, but no one has ever seen them there. Well, I do remember reading in the passage that no one has seen the eels in the Sargasso Sea, but I know that they don't live their whole lives there. The author spent a long time talking about how they moved from the sea to the river and then back from the river to the sea. So this one, not in the passage, it's wrong. Option D, this is our last chance. Female eels turn into silver eels toward the end of their lives. I do remember seeing that in the 5th paragraph. That was in the passage. But that's not a main idea, okay? The passage as a whole is not about female eels turning into silver eels. So even though it's there, this one doesn't answer the question. So at this point, we can be certain that the correct answer to this question is in fact B. And we've used our skill building strategies here to work our way to the correct answer. So when you're going through your reading passages and you come across a big picture question, try using these same strategies to help you determine the main idea.